Hello, what's going on? My name is Rich Ryan, bringing you another episode of the Reinforced Running Podcast. Today, I have my friend and very trusted coach, Ian Hosek. So, reached out to Ian, want to get him back on the podcast. It's been about a year since he's been on. Really love his knowledge and the things that he brings to the table. So, today we're talking all about running biomechanics and form fixes. So, Ian does offer this as a service, and I want you to keep that in mind throughout this whole part because he really drops some incredible information about really some tweaks you need to make, some of the things that you may have heard, and just kind of clearing up some of the misconceptions that might be out there about running form in general. So, excellent knowledge, really, really reliable stuff that you can put into practice like right now. As soon as you get done with this podcast, or if you're running during this podcast, which is a good way to consume this podcast, you can put this in place almost right away and just start thinking about the ways that you can improve your form. But like I said, Ian does offer this as a service on his website. So we mentioned that toward the end of the episode. Make sure to take a look at the link in the show notes to get a big gist of what this can do for you and get some professional eyeballs on you if you do want this as part of your practice. Because running form and the biomechanics of it are really, really, really important and can be often overlooked. So without further ado, here we go. Ian Hosek.
Let's just talk about something that everyone really hits on hard, which is Footstrike. And you mentioned you switched from heel strike to Footstrike, or forefoot strike over time.
Yeah, mostly forefoot. Like, not even like I was running so much on my basically on my toes at a point, and I still I still land there now, but I just did a drastic. I was like, I'm not letting my heel touch at all. And this was like when I was like maybe 23, all right. So I just took the little bit of information that I may have heard in like Runner's World or something like that, and I was like, okay, heel striking's out. So I just went forefoot.
Yeah, there was a big push, I don't know, like a number of years ago, to go to more of a midfoot or forefoot strike, um, to help with injury prevention. And the main reason people were going towards that was to get away from braking forces. And braking forces, for those of you who aren't familiar, is where you land with your foot in front of your center of mass, fairly far out. And when you land like that, it essentially acts like a car brake, and you have friction going against the direction you want to run, and that slows you down. It puts a lot of impact on your joints, muscles, ligaments, tendons, and bones. You get stress fractures that way, and it's really not an efficient way to run. Um, and that's why and most commonly you'll see heel strikers braking, and that's how those two got linked. However, they are not actually. It's more of a correlation than causation. Most of the time, you will see heel strikers braking, but not all heel strikers do brake. Um, and the biggest thing with that is you want to avoid that braking force and start landing under your center of mass. This is like the driving factor behind running. You want to maximize efficiency of momentum and keep the speed you already have going forward. And that involves landing under your center of mass or just slightly ahead of it. The reason I say slightly ahead is because if you did land directly under your center of mass and kept running, you would fall over. Or if you kept landing behind your center of mass, you would just tip over. And the cause of that is because you do have a slight lean, which we'll get into. And that way it maximizes the amount of gravity pull. Gravity is going to help you move forward. And that is where the misconception that heel striking causes braking forces. So cadence and stride length, which is how long of a distance you take in every step while running, are very heavily related. And they are actually functions of things, not driving factors. So if you go back to algebra, you have two things. You have the x, which is the input, and then the y, which is the output. Cadence and stride length are outputs. They are not inputs. So when you go into 180, that you're using it as an input, and that is not the case. It is an output, and that is related to how big you are in terms of limb length. So height is a driving factor, as well as how fast you're running. Those are the main things that are going to dictate your stride length and your cadence. 180 steps per minute is great for people who are around 5'7" to 5'9" and can run 450 pace for 10 kilometers. If you can do that, you should absolutely be running. If you're that size and you can run that fast, you probably should be running around 180 steps per minute. However, if you're like the rest of the 99.99% of the population who can't do that, 180 is not for you unless you're shorter. And that would be where that would come into play. Like if you are a shorter individual, you are going to be taking more steps and increasing your cadence because your stride length is shorter because your limb length is shorter. You tracking so far?
I'm with you, and because I'm thinking about it, it just seems packageable, right? It just seems sellable.
Oh yeah.
180,
I'm not
you know.
saying it's a bad like marketing thing in terms of like if you're just looking at it from the marketing sense. However, it's not right. Uh,
And
Before this call, I was looking up an article that actually summarized it outside online. They did a study looking at the 100K World Championships of individuals, and they looked at the men's field, and they took 12 athletes, and they had their cadence over the 4 to 5 hours, whatever it was for the duration. Guess what number they came out with as the average cadence for those 12 men?
for 100K,
Yeah,
168.
180 steps per minute.
No way.
Yeah, it was just about, I think it was 182. But when you look at the individual, each individual runner, the graph was
They're all
all
the
over the
same.
place. No, 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 they're all
Oh,
over the place.
oh, the average. I see. I see.
Sorry, I didn't. I may not have described that, but the
You
average
said the
between the
average, and I
12.
just thought about it. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
that makes sense.
Between the 12 people was 180. However, when you look at the data of the individuals, no one actually ran at 180. It was like
Oh,
155 up to like 190 or like 200, based on the height of the individual and the pace they were running. They
so
were all relatively close in terms of pace because world championship stuff, but there was that huge variation, and so you can't just look at the average. You have to look at the individual data as well, and that goes for everyone in the world as well. Like we're not all 5'8" and run a 450 10K. We have to talk about the forward lean. We've mentioned it a couple times, and you've mentioned it with the pose method. When running, you want to be maximizing free energy, like we talked about, and utilizing gravity. So in order to do that, you want to have a very slight forward lean instead of being completely vertical. That way, gravity is helping you fall, and running is just controlled falling at the most efficient state. Um, Downhill is a great example of that. If you lean back into the downhill, you slow down. But if you're running downhill and you lean into the hill, similar to the grade of the hill, you're going to go a lot faster. And that's just utilizing that energy. Um, so when you want to run, you want to have a very good alignment all the way from your hips up to the top of your head. What I'll have athletes and individuals do is just pretend a string's on the top of their head. It's pulling them from the top, and that way you have good posture in your spine, your torso, and your hips. You don't want your hips to be anteriorly rotated, which is where they rotate forwards. So if the top of your hips tried to touch the top of your toes, that would be like an example of anterior rotation. And then
right, like your lower back's curved a little bit. Like
exactly.
that's when
Oh,
you would get that interior pivot tilt. Yeah.
yep. And then you also don't want the inverse of that, which is the posterior tilt. And that would be if your back is rounded and like you're squeezing your core like really, really
Mm-hmm.
hard if you were doing like a sit up or a crunch. You want to have a neutral pelvis, is what we call that. Um,
Mm.
and so then you're in that nice standing upright position. If you were to fall over or like just pretend to fall and then catch yourself, that's usually the position, and maintaining good alignment of your torso the entire time, and you catch yourself and continue forward while running, that would be a fairly nice, easy way to mimic how to run properly with that forward lean. And that's actually a drill I have people do to help practice the lean. Is you'll get in that alignment position, and you want to have a little tiny core engagement to help prevent rounding of your back. Usually that helps with actually anterior tilt, or get rid of that just by squeezing your
Hmm.
core, because it engages you, pulls you in more. You don't want to like be doing like you're about to do a deadlift. You don't want to lock it down, but you do want some tension. So you get that position, you fall forward, and then you continue running. That's the easiest way to teach the forward lean. And when you do that, it automatically, uh, if you don't think about it, you don't overstride. So with that lean, it also helps prevent the braking force that we've talked about. And usually it'll transition to more of a midfoot or forefoot strike, but as we mentioned, that isn't always the case, and you can heel strike successfully.
This feels like when this is like honed in and on point, it feels like running is just much more gentle. It doesn't feel as like this huge, like pounding or this huge force or like this big hustle of a movement. Like if your lean's on point and you're just kind of replacing that each foot to control yourself while you're falling, like it feels way better.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see people doing when the forward lean is not dialed in? Like, what does it look like, or how does it like feel for people? Would you say?
It's different for everything. I did a running clinic before the pandemic happened where actually I had this woman. We taught her the forward lean drill. She was killing it. Everything looked phenomenal, but she was still like overstriding a little bit and heel striking. I was like, what is going on? It turns out after a few minutes of talking with her, she was actively flexing her toes to the sky. So
Whoa!
dorsiflexing. Yeah,
During
during running. And that's a thing people do. I didn't know that. If you're out there, think about this.
you,
And
you'll see people that have holes in the front of their on the tops of their shoes.
mm-hmm,
They'll wear a hole
wear
through
'em.
there. I wonder if
Yep,
that's
it's
probably
probably it.
why.
And
Yeah.
so that really cued me in on while you're doing this, you want to be relaxed. You want to have a relaxed facial position, relaxed body posture. Your shoulders are relaxed. Your core can be slightly engaged. Um, you still want to be going through the running mechanics, but your ankles should be relaxed and nothing should be overly stiff. You're utilizing it's so it's not like sprinting or accelerating out of the gate where you're actively creating force and acceleration. But while running, you want to be utilizing as much free energy as you can, and that's the energy of momentum and gravity. So continuing forwards, and it should feel smooth. You shouldn't be working overly hard. You shouldn't feel like really high impact or joint pains. You mentioned it's just like flowing. I did this. We did a little bit of this right before Seattle with Johnny Linolimo when I was working with him back in the day. Um, and we just went on a little like gravel road, and I was like, we need to fix a few of these mechanics. Like, this is what I want to see. And we went him from like just like a 20-foot section. He hit like 430, like no problem. He was like, this is weird. It's free, and like I feel flowy. It's fast. And once you hit that sweet spot, you can just go, and you want to go fast. Something to remember though is the more you lean, the faster you're going to want to go. So
Hmm.
the faster you're going, the greater the lean will be.
So let me ask you about, well, to go back to the toe situation again. And this is a cue that I kind of use again personally. And I've seen some drills and used some drills and prescribed them a couple times, and like how to utilize like your big toe and like where that should kind of play into the fact. Because like when I kind of get into trouble with my landing is if I start landing a lot on the outside of my foot, and it kind of creates some swinging internally, and I get some hip flexor stuff, or like just my feet will get kind of beat up.
Mm-hmm.
But if I cue myself to drive that big toe down as I'm landing, it just kind of levels out my foot, for lack of better terms, and it
Mm-hmm.
just feels like I'm landing straight down. Is there any merit to something like that, or are you worried? Are you concerned about how people's foot is actually approaching the ground?
That is a fantastic question and leads me into something I wanted to talk about. Um,
Perfect.
so you're killing it, Rich. Uh,
Thank you.
it's most common for people to land like you on the outside of their foot. That's not a big deal. It depends. What's the major thing is what your foot does after that and the severity of how much you're landing on that. Um, if you're landing on it and then coming onto the middle of your foot or the medial side and then rocking in and then becoming to a level position and staying stable there, that's great. However, if you continue on and do essentially your arch collapses, that's where you'll start to develop shin splints and posterior tib syndrome, which can eventually lead to stress fractures or stress reactions. Uh, and usually the most common thing for that is runners and just people in general have really weak hips. Like our
Hmm.
abductors, or essentially when you're trying to take your legs, your toes and spread them apart away from your midline, are very weak. We sit a lot. We don't do much lateral motion unless you're in ball sports. Those guys have a lot stronger hips. But if you're a runner or cyclist, or you do something steady state in what's called the sagittal plane, which is just the plane that runs through the center of you and it goes forwards and back, and you don't go side to side, you just go forwards and back, you're not working those muscles very much, and they're really weak, and they cause you to plant more medially or more towards your center line. When you do that, you're naturally going to strike on the outside of your foot and then come in and then collapse. And if you, depending on the shoes you have, as well as how strong your lower leg muscles are, they're going to start to get fatigued over time. And that's where you'll see a lot of injuries result from.